China says it is evaluating an offer from the United States to hold talks over tariffs. As the trade war between the world's two biggest economies continues, microchips are front and centre in the fight. China needs them for its global tech ambitions. Right now, the US is still dominant in the market.
China, first row. China.
The US and China, the world's two biggest economies, are locked in an increasingly brutal battle for tech supremacy. Donald Trump has allowed temporary exemptions on smartphones and computers and other electronics from his punishing tariffs on China. But he believes that by reviving manufacturing of microchips on American soil, he can free the economy and turbocharge US tech, such as artificial intelligence.
We're number one in AI by far. We're leading China by a lot, by tremendous amounts.
Chinese leader Xi Jinping needs high-tech microchips to fulfill his dream of transforming China into a technology powerhouse. But China doesn't manufacture these chips or the machinery to make them. Microchips are invented in the US, and American companies command nearly half of the global chip market, compared with around 7% in China. Most of the world's chips are actually made in Asia, however. Supply chains have gone global. An Apple iPhone, for example, may contain chips that were designed in the US, manufactured in Taiwan, Japan or South Korea, using rare earths which were mostly mined in China. Next, they may be sent to Vietnam for packaging, then to China for assembly and testing, before being shipped to the US. While China has been catching up with the US in areas like e-vehicles, green tech and high-speed trains, it still trails in semiconductors. Experts believe China lags 5 years behind global leaders in commercial manufacturing of advanced logic chips. For that, Xi must rely on the US and its allies, and their willingness to share the technology. But restrictions have been imposed for some time on chips for China's defense industry. As the US and Chinese economies decouple at a dizzying pace, both depend on Taiwan, a US ally, for semiconductors. Taiwan, which China claims as its territory and repeatedly threatens to invade, is by far the world's biggest manufacturer of microchips. In the home of this chip-making colossus, the trade war could escalate into a hot war.
For more on this, our reporter and China analyst Clifford Coonan joins us. Clifford, are we going to get the US and China at the negotiating table all of a sudden?
Well, it's interesting. We've just had a statement from the Commerce Ministry, China's Commerce Ministry today, saying that they're prepared to consider talks. Mm-hmm. Everything is couched in this very, very cautious language. The Chinese are really angry, and they've reiterated their demand that US drop its tariffs. 145% is effectively an embargo. It means that there can be very, very little trade. And it's one of these things where there can be no winners, really. So ultimately, it's a political thing, and I think that they have to have talks. They've had so much in common for so long, in trade terms anyway, and it's been very beneficial for the US for so long. At the same time, a lot needed to be done about China. There are a lot of imbalances there, but those sort of issues are now secondary, and I think it's coming down to a political argument, and I think there will be talks.
OK, well, let's look at the domestic politics. What sort of pressure is there on Xi to get these talks rolling?
Well, I think, first of all, the Chinese this is being presented as a campaign, a struggle, something for the people to get behind, that the Communist Party will lead them to victory. There's a kind of a propaganda element there that's very important. So politically, in some ways, it's quite beneficial for Xi. But on the other hand, there's a lot of problems in the Chinese economy at the moment. There's the property crisis still hasn't been resolved, and Chinese consumers aren't spending any money. And as long as there's a trade war, no one's investing because the situation is too uncertain. The Chinese economic growth miracle that we've seen over the last 4 decades or whatever is built on exports. It's an export growth model. It needs exports. $440 billion a year going to the US alone. That's a lot. And if that falls by 75%, which is very, very possible, even more in the coming months, that's going to be very, very difficult for the Chinese economy to absorb and for Xi Jinping to absorb. So he's not really under pressure because they have a very strong control of society, of China. But ultimately, they do need this trade to continue if the economy is to keep doing well.
Two completely different political systems that we're talking about. the world's top two economies. Which side can hold out longer in this dispute if it drags on?
I think the received wisdom is generally that China can probably hold out longer because of the control that it has. It's not a democracy. It doesn't have. They can't be voted out, and it's very unlikely that there'll be social unrest, really significant social unrest, because of the strong controls, the surveillance. So China has that advantage. Whereas in the US, consumers, if they start having to pay a couple of $1,000s for an iPhone, they're going to get very unhappy. And Trump is very, very sensitive to political changes there. So I think that there's a real, I think probably China can hold out. But as I said, there can be no real winners in this. There's only going to be two losers.
But where does this leave the chip-building champion, Taiwan?
Taiwan is in a very unfortunate situation. We've seen now Marco Rubio has long been a champion of Taiwan, and he's now moving into the national security position in the US. And Trump has been a bit critical of Taiwan. There's 32% trade tariffs there too. But Taiwan needs the US to protect itself against China. So it's in a difficult position now. But again, I think there's going to be discussions here too. I think a lot of this is being set up as something so that he can make a political victory.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting, intriguing story. Thank you very much for coming in and leading us through it step by step. Clever Coonan there.